Joanne Lippman, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Well, John, thank you so much for having me.
What a great book to write, especially now, sort of post-COVID, when everybody has had this kind of they've either resigned from their jobs or they've had this chance to really reflect on where they are in their careers and maybe want to make a change in their life. So good timing for sure.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we're all in that space right now.
We really, really are. I don't know one person that isn't like kind of looking at their life and saying like, do I really want to be doing this? So I'm excited to kind of get into all the details because it's such a great book, and because you're a really good reporter, it's so well researched. And but before we even get into the heart of the book, I want to get into your own career and your own sort of pivoting, because you have had a career in very much like mine, where it seemed to start in print journalism. And now you're writing books and speaking. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about the arc of your career, sort of, if you wouldn't mind telling us sort of how you started and how you ended up where you are now. I know could probably be an entire podcast, but if you could sort of maybe give me the abbreviated version here.
I will I'm going to try and give you the short version
Yes.
here. So I started my career at the Wall Street Journal, and I spent 22 years there.
Wow.
It was something, the Wall Street Journal came to my house every single day. My dad read it, and I'd never picked it up, but I knew I wanted to be a journalist. And when I was a freshman in college, my dad, I got an internship, an unpaid internship at a magazine that is no longer with us. And I would commute from New Jersey to New York every day with my dad. And of course, this is pre-iPhone days.
Yes.
And out of sheer boredom, I finally picked up his Wall Street Journal, and I was transfixed. I was 18 years old, and I was like, oh my gosh, the writing in this paper, particularly these front page stories, was so dramatic and wonderful. And I realized that, like, when you read that paper every day, it was like serialized great television, right? You're reading about these great takeovers and huge personalities. And I couldn't wait to pick it up every day. And so it became my goal in life to get that Wall Street Journal internship when I was in college. And
did you have an interest in business? Did you have, were you
none?
Love the writing?
No, I was a history major. I had been drawn to writing from a very young age, actually, from the age of 7, when I read the book Harriet the Spy, which
Cool.
If any of your listeners have read,
I'm sure it's been formative for many people.
So many journalists have told me the same thing. It's about an 11-year-old girl, and she spies on all of her family and friends, and she writes it all down in a book, in a notebook. And so my mom got me like a series of notebooks starting when I was 7, and I would spy on my big sisters and their boyfriends and the neighbors and my Hebrew school teacher, you name it, right?
Right.
And at some point along the way, I realized, oh, wait a second, there's an actual career in actually interviewing people and hearing what they have to say and writing about it, journalism. And so I knew I wanted to be a journalist, but it wasn't until I picked up the Wall Street Journal that I realized this is what the kind of reporting and writing that I want to do. I was so taken by the storytelling, and realizing that business really is stories, and it's really about people. There is no such thing as a company that does things. It's always people that do things. So anyway, I fell in love with that. I had a great summer, and they hired me. So when I graduated, I went straight to the Wall Street Journal, and I stayed for 22 years, starting as a reporter and working my way up to becoming page 1 editor. And then I created Weekend Journal, and then I created Personal Journal, and was named the deputy managing editor, which is basically deputy editor-in-chief of the paper. And I had a wonderful career there and was very happy there. But I was approached by Cy Newhouse.
Yes, I know Cy. He's a legendary man. I think we all have Cy Newhouse stories.
Yes. Tell me yours.
My only Cy Newhouse, I didn't really actually have any interaction with him. So just so our listeners know, Cy Newhouse, the former, I think he's passed now, right? But Cy Newhouse is part of the Newhouse family, which started Condé Nast magazine and really ran an empire of media, and also has the Cy Newhouse School at Syracuse. But my story with him is I was in the Condé Nast building. This is when it was on Times Square, because I worked at Glamour magazine, and he got in the elevator, and he he was he wanted to get wherever floor he wanted to get to. He really wanted to get to it. He was pressing the button like I just remember just sitting there going like, oh my God, he really, really wants to get to that floor, just jabbing the button. And I was like, Cy Newhouse is a tough guy. No, but I didn't know him personally. But tell me about your experience with Cy Newhouse.
Oh, it was amazing. I had written about Condé Nast at the Wall Street Journal, a not terribly flattering story. And so I never imagined that I would end up working there. But what happened was after, I was the deputy managing editor, I was running these other sections that were doing very, very well. And so I got a call one day, actually, from Cy Newhouse's office inviting me to lunch with him.
Wow.
And I was so excited, and it was going to be in the building. And then at the last minute, they changed it to his apartment. And it was so amazing. So I show up to his apartment. And
where was it? Like Central Park South or some crazy...
all the way by the UN building. And for the audience members who don't know about Cy, he was renowned for being somewhat reclusive and very eccentric and a major art collector.
Yes.
And so I go kind of fearfully tiptoe up to his door and knock on the door. He opens the door himself in socks and a sweatshirt. I mean, pants, obviously, but I mean, in at that time when everybody was wearing suits, he's in sweatpants and his socks, and invites me in. And you walk through this grand apartment with this amazing art, modern art all over the place, like coming out of the floor and all over the walls. And it leads me to what's essentially a small kitchen table. And it was he and his then editorial director, Tom Wallace, an amazing, brilliant guy, and myself. And it was just a quiet little informal lunch. And he just kept asking me questions. He said, look, we're considering at Condé Nast creating a business magazine. And Condé Nast at that time, and still, Condé Nast is the publisher of Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, Vogue, Architectural Digest.
Glamour.
It did not have a Glamour.
Yes.
And GQ. Yep. But it didn't have a business magazine. And so he said, we're thinking about launching a business magazine. And he just started asking me questions about, like, what do you think a magazine should look like? And I was so excited. I was like, you guys are the only company that ought to be starting a business magazine, because you are the guys who have you got your finger on the pulse of culture and beautiful photography and the best writers. And you can combine that with business knowledge. And the analogy that I used at the time, I said, I'm always reading about what's going on at Lincoln Center and, what the board is doing over at Lincoln Center and the chairman of the board. And then I go to the business page, and it's about this hedge fund manager who's ruling the world. And guess what? It's the same people, right? It's the hedge fund manager on the business page is the same guy who's overseeing this renovation of Lincoln Center, but never the two ever meet. Like, nobody connects those dots. And I said, Condé Nast is where you can connect those dots. And we had such a wonderful conversation.
And you weren't prepped for this at all. Did you have any idea what was coming?
I did not. I knew that they were thinking of creating a business magazine, but I did not know what I was in for in this conversation. But it was the most amazing conversation. It was like very Socratic. He didn't opine a lot. He was just asking a lot of questions, and it was stuff that I loved to talk about. I subscribed to a million magazines, and I loved the look and the feel and the photography and the writing. And so it was a really fun conversation. And I remember leaving and saying, well, if I never talk to him again, never see him again, this is a highlight of my life. This was such an amazing experience. And I got back to my office and basically sent a note and said, would you like to come to Condé Nast and create the magazine that you just told me about at lunch?
Wow.
And it was amazing. And honestly, I was not prepared for it. I didn't realize that was coming. And it took me another couple of months to say yes, because I really was not thinking about leaving the Wall Street Journal, where I was very, very happy. But ultimately I did. And we created Condé Nast Portfolio. And it had a wonderful yet short life.
Well, and really probably mainly because of the timing, right? It just came out. When did it come out?
It came out in 2007, and we had spectacular, really great coverage leading up to and essentially predicting the financial crisis. And in fact, our cover story about the financial crisis of 2008 was written by Michael Lewis. We had assigned it to him months before. We knew something was up, like things were going off the rails. And so we asked Michael Lewis to look into this for an end of the year piece. And by the time his piece came out at the end of the year, everything had crashed. Lehman Brothers had crashed. And he wrote this brilliant cover story that turned into his book and then the film, The Big Short.
Wow.
So we had great coverage, but at the same time, the financial crisis killed us. And, the advertising market fell apart. Condé Nast killed a bunch of magazines, and ultimately tried to keep ours open because it was a real, Cy really loved the magazine. And he really tried to keep it going, but they had to keep closing magazines. And so ultimately, in late April of 2009, they finally had to pull the plug. But it was a wonderful experience while it lasted. And I feel so fortunate that I got to experience sort of the end of the great Cy Newhouse era.
Yeah, really the end of, and the great the great Cy Newhouse era sort of coincided with the rise and fall of print magazines.
Yeah.
So a lot of people at this stage in their career might have been like, oh shit, like I had this kind of golden ticket at the Wall Street Journal. I gave it up for this dream, and now that is tanked. What did you do next? Were you panicked a little bit about what to do next?
I really wasn't. I felt like I remember the day that it closed. I remember I came home and my kids at the dinner table were like, "Oh, Mom, are you okay? Are you crying? Are you all right?" And I said, no, because I put 150% of myself, 200% of myself, and so did our staff. I mean, it was just everybody put everything they could into that magazine, and so there was no feeling of regret that we should have, could have, would have done
Yeah,
something different. Um, but I will tell you, at that point, I had been working for 30 years nonstop, and I was exhausted.
right.
And so I actually took off 6 months. I refused to do anything else. Like, people would come my way and ask me to come and talk to them, and potential offers and stuff. And I really needed a break, which I learned, by the way, in report. This ties into
Yeah.
Next, the book, because I found that actually is incredibly important.
Yeah, I
That
want to talk
ability
about
to,
that
yeah,
that
yeah,
ability to
yeah.
stop and take
So, but
time.
ultimately, what I used, I decided I had things on my bucket list I wanted to do. So I wrote a book. I co-authored a book totally outside the business realm called Strings Attached. It was a music memoir,
Mm,
written with my childhood friend Melanie Kopczynski, who's a longtime violinist with Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and her father I was a very serious violist when I was a little kid, all
okay.
through college, and so we wrote this book together about her father. It's like a Tuesdays with Maury kind of
Hmm.
book, but about a music teacher. It was a passion project. I went to, I did a lot of work. I really was able to pivot into working with digital companies. I did a lot of consulting. I wanted to expand my range because print was
Yeah,
dying.
you can see it coming. Yeah.
Yeah. So I did a lot with audio. I did a lot with digital, and that was fun. And then ultimately went back to Gannett as the chief content officer of Gannett, overseeing its, at the time, 110 newspapers plus USA Today. And in addition to that, I was also the editor-in-chief of USA Today.
Oh, that's a
Um,
pretty small job. So you're overseeing all of the newspapers, and plus you're the editor in chief of USA.
yes.
Nice.
Yes, that was a busy time because I was
Yeah.
also writing a book at the time. I was
Did you have to move to
kind of
Washington?
insane. I did have to move to Washington, and my family is here, so I was commuting. It
Yeah.
was
Oh, wow.
crazy. It was crazy.
Wow.
But I was writing another book at the time, and so I used those long train rides productively.
So yeah, that's actually actually love that train ride from New York to Washington. So tell me about when you decided that maybe it was time to leave, you know, publishing, and or at least to leave the media publishing, and start your own kind of career as an author and a speaker and a thought leader.
Yeah. So what happened was, the book that I was writing while I was at Gannett is a book called That's What She Said, and it is about closing the gender gap. And I started it um, because I was at Gannett. The book was delayed. I missed my deadline, which is the first time ever in my life. But as a result of me missing my deadline, the Me Too movement happened.
Hmm.
And so it just exploded, and
You have good timing with these things. My goodness.
that one was very unintentional.
Yeah.
Um, but it exploded. And so there was all of this attention being paid now, and there was a lot of demand. And I felt like a real passion about just being an advocate for this. And and I really couldn't be an advocate for gender equality and be out there and speaking and talking and working with organizations while doing my day job, and also while being, an editor-in-chief. Like the two were not compatible. Plus, I think, it was a very difficult decision. Honestly, I loved my job. But I think what between the passion for the work and the fact that the commute was really, really, really difficult, to not live with my family was very hard. And so I made the decision to leave, and to focus on writing books and speaking and working with organizations that really wanted to try and move the needle in closing the gender gap.
So the gender gap issue is a huge issue, and it's interesting. Did it resonate with you in the industry that you were coming from in publishing? Because I feel like, sort of my experience, of course, in publishing is that I worked for women's magazines my entire career, up until for a long time. So I actually had almost the opposite experience, where I worked at Glamour magazine. I was probably one of 3 men that worked at the whole magazine. But that was definitely not the norm. But what gave you that idea and that passion for that topic?
Yeah, it was because, what got me on this was because throughout my career, my mentors, at the Wall Street Journal, it was when
Probably
I
a boys' club.
joined, and particularly, it was almost all men.
Yeah.
But all my bosses had been men, and they were fantastic. I mean, I've written and talked about this, how when my kids were born, and this is the pre-internet days, like there was no remote work. And when my kids were born, I was like, I've got to cut back. I need to work part-time or even quit. And my bosses did everything in their power to keep me there. And then not only that, they let me work at home sometimes, which was unusual then. But beyond that, the key is, and this is so important, my bosses, and particularly Paul Steiger, who ran the Wall Street Journal and is my hero and my mentor, they kept offering me promotions, and I kept turning them down for 5 years when my kids were babies and little, until my son, went to kindergarten. Every time there was a great opportunity, they would come to me and they'd, do you want to be London bureau chief?
Wow.
Big jobs. Do you want to run a section? And I would say no, because at the time I was on Page One. I was an editor on Page One, which was a great, exciting job, editing those great stories that drew me to the
little
paper in the first
illustration.
place. Yeah. So I love that job, but they were offering me promotions from that job, but that job was more manageable with having little kids at home, whereas these others would require a move. They would require less predictable time. So I kept saying no, but here's the thing. They never crossed me off the list. And so many of my peers who came up when I did women, so many of my peers, if they said no, or they wanted to step back for a little bit, they were crossed off the list, and they never got the opportunities, and they eventually left or got squeezed out. My bosses never forgot about me. And so for 5 years, they would come to me. And finally, my son was in kindergarten, and Paul Steiger came to me and said, do you want to create a brand new 4th section? You have a blank slate to create a 4th section of the Wall Street Journal. And my son was just entering kindergarten. And I was like, hell yes, I want to do that. And that was what really launched the career that led me to where I am today. Had he not offered me all those opportunities and not forgotten about me, had I been mommy tracked, there's no way I would be sitting here with you today. And it just makes you realize how important it is for particularly early career women, or anybody who's got a lot of responsibility at home, who wants to step back for a little while, to not forget that they've got that amazing potential, and to keep thinking about them and offering them the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about how you seg from being this expert in this, and you have a best-selling book about this topic, about gender inequity, gender gap. But then you write a book that's actually very different. So you could have maybe stuck with that topic and become the sort of the expert in that particular field, but you went to a totally different. So why did you make that transition, and why was next the topic that you decided to go with?
Yes. Well, just to be clear, I do still work in the gender area and still talk and write about that. But but next, the power of reinvention in life and work. What it is it's a deeply reported guide to navigating how, navigating change in how
Yeah.
we live, work, lead, and also into how do we inspire innovation and creativity in others. And it taps into this zeitgeist, into this moment in time that we are all in right now, when so many people are burned out, so many people are looking for a more meaningful career or life. And the inspiration for this was the pandemic.
Mhm.
It was really at the very start of the pandemic. I have a chapter in the book on aha moments that change your life.
Yeah.
I had one. I had one. And
You
it
had an
was
aha?
I had an aha moment early in the pandemic. I kid you not. I woke up in the middle of the night saying, I need to write a book, because we were all so when the pandemic happened, like millions of other people, my entire work life came to a grinding halt,
Mm,
right? Like there were no more speaking, like people were not talking about gender because they weren't going to work. They were like,
right.
people were being sent home and people were dying and people were on the front lines. And so the world stopped for all of us. We were stopped in our tracks, and it just shook for everybody. And I woke up in the middle of the night saying, you know what, we're all like, I don't know what my new normal is going to be. Like, I don't know where I go from here. And none of us do. And there's no roadmap for this. And I said, I need to understand for myself. But I saw it in my own family, where we were all experiencing, our friends, and you could see it in the entire world. We're all experiencing this feeling of like, what's our new normal? And here we are, 3 years later, after the pandemic has started, like literally 3 years later. And, the health crisis, thankfully, is receding, but our search for what is that new normal is just as urgent as ever, if not even more so. We're still
Yeah.
searching for that.
Everything
And
is changing. Yeah.
yeah, I realized there's really no roadmap for that. And I wanted to understand, how do we get there from here? And so that was the impetus for the book. The other thing that I realized is, when you think about kind of seismic change or transition, or you're rethinking your life or your career, we all actually, everybody in the world is going to go through these major transitions at some point in their life, right? It's like you're rethinking your job, or you get laid off, or you get married, or you get divorced, or there's an illness or a death in the family, right? We all have these moments. But with the pandemic, it was the first time in our lifetimes that this giant moment of transition hit all of us, all at the same time, all at once.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand, how do people get through that?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, yes, some of people just had this, maybe had the luxury of maybe thinking of, I want to do something else, right? Some people, it was more of a necessity, like they lost their job, or but everybody seemed to want to be, and still seems to want to be, making some sort of change, whether they
Yes.
want to or whether they just have to. But how do you know? Let's say you're on the side of, I have a job. I'm not really happy. It feels like I have no meaning in my life, or I'm not making enough money, or whatever it is that's motivating you. How do you know it's time to make that pivot and that jump? Like, is it just like, or like, how do you take stock?
Right. So the way that I approached this exact question was, what I wanted to do was I sought out people who had successfully made really big pivots. And some were in career, some were people who changed careers, some were people who came back from just massive failure, some were people who had life-changing aha moments, some were people who had terrible trauma in their life and had to figure out how to go on after terrible trauma. And I was looking for people who had succeeded, so that they could walk me through, like, how do you get from there to here? And then what I did was, each one of those kinds of transitions that I just explained to you, each one, there's actually a body of research, and there are researchers and academics who actually study. There's, career management gurus, there's psychologists who study trauma. There are neuroscientists who study aha moments and creativity. Anyway, so then I talked to all the experts to help me understand why these transitions and these big transformations succeed.
Right.
And the really cool thing was, when I talked to the experts, they all walked me through, there are stages that you go through in a successful transition. And they all walked me through in their specialty, and they all used different words, but I mapped it all out because I was trying to make sense of it all. I mapped it all out, and I realized every one of them was talking about the same process, but they
Right.
were using different
Different
words.
words.
And once we understand the process, which I can walk you through the steps.
Yeah,
uh,
let's, because
yeah.
I think you're talking about the four S's here, right?
Yes.
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 So talk about how you distilled it and what the four S's are.
Sure, sure. So essentially what they're all talking about are, there's 4 steps. I call them search, struggle, stop, solution. I'll
Okay.
walk you through real quick, and then we can talk about some
Yeah.
examples, like how that shows up. So search is the very first step, and that is when you start collecting information about where you're actually going to end up. The cool thing about this search phase is that for almost everybody I interviewed, they didn't know what they didn't realize they were searching. Maybe it was a hobby or some random interest, or they were collecting information. They were doing the work without even realizing it. It was totally unintentional that they were collecting this information. Then comes the struggle. So the struggle is this really important part in the middle. It's not so fun, and it can last a long time, but it's when you're sort of disconnecting yourself from your previous identity, from the identity you had, but you haven't quite figured out the identity where you're going to land. And
Mm.
it can feel very, very uncomfortable, but it's actually hugely important. And it's also something that we tend to minimize that when we hear these big success transformation
But we
stories,
don't want
but
to talk about the negative, the conflict and the unpleasantness, because
we
that
don't like to
struggle
talk.
phase. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't like to talk about that, and we don't like to experience it. So,
Yeah.
but it happens with 100% of everybody. You have that struggle, and very often, not always, but very often, that struggle leads to step 3, which is a stop. The stop is either something that you may choose, like I'm quitting my job, or it might be something thrust on you, like I got laid off from my job, or there was an illness or a divorce in my family, or there's a pandemic and it makes us all
Yeah.
stop. And only then does everything sort of coalesce, and you realize what is the solution, the final step there, which is the solution. And we can walk through if you want.
Yeah.
Like there's
I
some.
would love to, because so I kind of, to come back to my original question, and we'll start with the search stage, right? So, like you said, you may be searching for a new opportunity without even realizing it. Like maybe you're, reading books. I mean, I can tell you my own example. I started this podcast initially as an assignment for a marketing class that I was taking, because I decided that I needed to be better at marketing. And it was like you had to create some project. So I started a podcast marketing myself as a sort of ghostwriter, write for hire, and did this thing called Write About Now. It has nothing to do with what this podcast has ended up becoming, which is basically bringing on smart people like you to talk about their books and articles and stuff. But the point was, it has now showed me that I have this incredible passion for podcasting. I absolutely love podcasting, and I've been trying to figure out since then how to monetize it, how to make a living podcasting, and I've started my own business. Whatever. We don't have to get into me, but tell me, how to identify that one is even searching when they don't even know they are. Like, how do you know that it might be time? Like, this is the thing I should maybe be doing.
Right, right. So you're going to go through these steps first. And by the way, you're a great example. I should have put you in the book. You
Damn
are a
it.
perfect
Well,
example of this.
I know, and yet I'm still always thinking about what I should be doing. Yeah.
So the way you know is generally you're in the struggle and the stop phase. So I'll give you an example of one of my favorites. I met this wonderful, wonderful guy named Chris Donovan out of Boston, and Chris, for 30 years, was a telephone repairman. So he grew up in a working class family where you get a job, like that's all you do, right? And you stay in your job and you want a steady income. But Chris, even starting from when he was a teenager, he had this kind of secret hobby, because when he was a teenager at Catholic school, some girl showed up in these like wacky shoes, and he was fascinated by the architectural nature of these crazy shoes. So he started sketching, and he started just notebooks full of, over the years, just sketching um, almost like literally detailed architectural drawings of like fantastical shoes.
Mm,
And it was for fun. And as he said, like, that's not a thing. That's not a job. it was
right.
it was a hobby. And it was also one he was not telling his fellow telephone repairmen about, right? It was like in a drawer. And ultimately, when he was already, he'd already was in his 30s, I think, maybe even beyond, he met his now husband and finally showed these drawings to his now husband. And his husband said to him, these are really, really good. Like, this is something that you actually could pursue. And this is at the point where he's in the struggle. He's been, again, without realizing it's searching, he's been honing all of these drawings over the years. Now he's struggling. He's saying, wait a second, my life is not fulfilled. Like, I'm a repairman, but like, I really have this other dream. And it was a really difficult time for him. And that went on for several years. But then what happened is he was stricken with cancer. He got prostate cancer. That
Mm,
was the stop. And he said, when he got, stricken with cancer, he said it just got him thinking, like, life is too short. Like, if I ever wanted to do this, I should do it. And so fortunately he recovered. And when he recovered at age 50, he took early retirement from the phone company and used his retirement savings to go back to design school, and came out, started his own shoe line. He is now Chris Donovan Shoes. You can buy him online. They're super cool. He is a couture women's shoe designer. He was named the Best of Boston by Boston Magazine, Best New Designer. They called him Boston's newest fashion superstar. He was 61 years old.
mm.
And so for anyone, like, the lesson to me there is, it's that point where you really start disassociating from your previous life. When you've collected enough information where you start thinking there's something else there. I mean, if you look at like Ina Garten, who's the barefoot Contessa, if you look
Yeah.
at how she tells her story, she was a budget analyst working in the White House. And she gave dinner parties on her weekends, and she did Julia Child recipes. And she realized that she enjoyed doing that more than she enjoyed her day job. And she actually needed a nudge. And I talk about this in one of the chapters. We talk about an expert companion,
Yeah.
because very often it takes somebody else to recognize skills that either you don't have, or you don't realize that you have, strengths you don't realize you have, to give you that encouragement and that confidence. And she talks about how she saw an ad. She was frustrated at work. She wasn't that happy. She loved her dinner parties. She saw an ad for a store, like a little food specialty store in West Hampton, New York, called the Barefoot Contessa. It already had the name. And she was telling her husband, who clearly her expert companion, about it. And he said, you know what, you should go for it. Like, you love cooking. You have a passion for this that I don't see in your day job, and you should go for it. And it was that nudge that allowed her to kind of take that jump.
Yeah, I love that idea of the expert companion, because, not everybody sort of might be like a barefoot Contessa where you just kind of have this secret passion that you now want to make into your real job. Like, maybe I hear a lot of people say, I don't really know what I want to do other than what I do now. Like, they're kind of stuck. And having like an expert companion sort of help you along is such a great, I mean, in both journeys. One is to sort of come up with the idea of what might be an alternative path, but also to sort of encourage you along the way. You had a great quote, actually, which I pulled out from your book, from Cindy, I don't know how you,
Stivers, yeah.
Stivers, who I remember her name because she was the editor-in-chief of Time Out. And I think I probably have written her letters to try to work at Time Out at some time in my life. I just remembered her name. But she said, I learned a huge lesson that when you're taking stock of what you ought to be doing with your life, talk to somebody who has watched you in action and ask them what they think your strengths are. I had skills that were so second nature to me, I didn't value them or list them. So the idea that you can ask a friend or ask an associate, what do you think my strengths are? Like, maybe you don't, because sometimes you don't know yourself, like what you're good at, right? Like,
Yes.
or what you excel at. Like, it's hard to look at yourself in that way, and to sort of ask somebody else, well, not sort of like, what do you think I should be doing, but more like, what do you think I'm good at? Like, especially a work companion, right?
100%. That
Yeah.
is so true. And I actually just yesterday I was speaking with college students, college journalism students. I was giving them a talk. And one of the things I said to them is, you know, when you're looking for a job, you don't understand what you have to offer because you guys are digital and social media natives, and you know how to do TikTok. You,
Right.
you know how to you
I
know
know.
how to rule social media, and the people who are going to be hiring you and you're interviewing with, yeah, they don't have those skills. Like that is so valuable if you want to go into journalism
Right. So they
or
need a you to tell them that, right? Because they might
yes,
not be
yeah.
aware because they think in their mind, well,
It's
everybody
so
knows how to do
innate,
TikTok.
right?
Yeah.
In their mind, everybody can do that, but they don't realize how special it is that they do. But that expert companion idea is so important. I had it. You know, you asked about going from the Wall Street Journal to Condé Nast, and I told you how hard it was for me to make that transition and how it took several months. And really, what helped me was my own expert companion, which was my husband. And what he said to me that was the actual decision point was, he said, when you talk about what you could do at Condé Nast, he said, I see your face light up in a way that I have not seen in years. And he could reflect back to me what he was seeing in just my physical aspect,
Mm.
right? When I thought about this other opportunity. And it was very persuasive to, you know, for him to be able to see that in a way that I could not.
Do you have to, so do you sort of have to have a passion for the thing that you want to pivot to? Like, is that a very, because you could also make a sort of calculated decision, like, I see an opportunity here to have success that I don't think enough people are doing. So I'm going to do this idea. And it's like a clever idea, but you might not have like the passion for it. Do you think that matters?
You know, this is such a great question. And it ties back to what you were just saying before, which is, do you have to know what your goal
Right.
is? Right? These are
Yeah.
two related questions. One of the most interesting findings in the book is that for many, if not most of the people who I interviewed, they didn't know where they were going. And this is so
Mm.
counterintuitive. Think about all the business books you and I have ever read, you know,
Yeah.
starting with Think and Grow Rich, that's almost 100 years old, that's
Right.
still a bestseller. The tried and true business advice is figure out your goal and then work backwards and take all your steps to focus on it to get to your goal. That's wrong. I mean,
Mm.
yes, it's great. If you want to be a doctor, you damn well
Yeah.
better take
You got
those
to have a
steps.
plan.
You
Yeah.
got to have a plan, definitely. But for so many of the people who I interviewed, they had no idea where they would end up because it was their interest, their hobbies, whatever took them in that direction. And they didn't have a goal to get there. And they didn't think they had a passion to get there. So, I mean, one of the great examples is a farmer who I met named Will Brown. So Will Brown is a cattle farmer in upstate New York and has a huge landholder there, and he sends his cattle off to slaughter and whatever. And I spent a couple of days following him around, and he castrates the cows and he makes the
Mm.
hay, and he's leading the cows from one pasture to the next, and he's repairing hoses. Like very grueling work. It is not glamorous work. But Will Brown, it turns out, spent the first 30 years of his career as a Harvard-trained economist at J.P. Morgan in
Wow.
London and New York. And I said, how in the world did you become a farmer?
Right.
It was never in the plan. It was never, that's what he said. Like this was never anything he dreamed about. But what happened was when his family was young, he was a young banker, not making that much money, looking for a cheap place to escape to on the weekends. And he found this farm, this broken down farmhouse. So he buys this farmhouse and they fix it up. And it's meant to be a weekend home for them and their little kids. And but they really enjoy it there. And over time, he leases the land around it to a cattle farmer, just like for a dozen or 16 head of cattle. And but he's not doing anything, but he gets interested in what is this farmer doing. And over time, the cows escape and he helps round them up. The cows have calves and he learns how to birth the cows and castrate the males, which is what they do.
Mm.
He learns how to repair the fence. And over time, he spends more and more time doing this. And then the cattle owner passes away. And he's like, well, it's only 16 cows. We'll just like buy the cows because they're already here. How much work can that be? They eat the grass. Like, how much work can that be? And as he said, well, cows have calves. And like
Yeah.
suddenly it's multiplying and multiplying. And he ends up with this huge herd. And then he starts really getting into the business of it and selling to the farm to table restaurants and opening a farm store. And at some point, he and his wife realize they're spending way more time on the farm and it can no longer be like a little side hustle. And they have to make a decision, like farm life or city life. They cannot do both. And it was a tough decision, but ultimately farm life won, and now they're full-time cattle farmers, and he loves it. But again, as he said to me, we
Yeah.
would never have bought a farm with the idea of becoming a farmer. That
Right.
is a ridiculous thing
So
to think
it
about
seems to
doing.
me that it's the power of making that first step. You have to do something and put something into the universe, right? It might not work out, but you have to, like, rather than plan it all out, like you're saying, like, even with this podcast, I'll just use my own example. Like, I just started a podcast because it was a marketing assignment. I had no plan. I just, and again, we're going to come back to my example because I think it also resonates in a not so positive way. So, but it seems to me like there's power in just making the decision to do something different or to try
Yes.
something different. Yeah.
Yes. And that is actually, management professors will tell you that if you actually want to change careers at all, the first thing you really should do is talk about it, but take action. Don't just kind of think in your
Yeah.
head that might
People
be
overthink it.
interesting.
You talk about people
Yes.
overthinking it. Yeah.
Right. Don't overthink it. Like, do something. Like,
Right.
you can shadow somebody, read about, like, and also talking to somebody, your expert companion, or even writing down the research shows, even if you just write down your goal or your thoughts, it helps you to execute on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The idea is
Keep a
not just
journal. Yeah.
yeah. The idea is not just to have it like spinning around in your own head, talking to yourself.
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
so wise. And I think a lot of creative people, me included, do this where it's like you try to figure it out in your head, and you're never going to figure it out in your head. It's better to
100%.
yeah. Um
I've
all
been
right.
there. Yes.
You only have so much room in there. All right. So this brings us to the struggle. So a lot of the examples in your book are people who made these moves and then are successful. But one of the stories, and you do tell stories of, you do mention this, that not everybody is success. Like, you will sometimes make pivots and not be successful. I mean, look at Silicon Valley, is sort of filled with stories of people pivoting, like keep trying these different things, throwing things at the wall. Not everything works. In my own example, I can say that I started this podcast. It has a lot of listeners, and yet I've never really made that much money off of it. So, like, as far as monetizing it, has not been particularly a success. Now, as a result of having this podcast, I was able to start a side hustle with a podcast production company where I produce podcasts for other companies and people and thought leaders. And so I have been able to make money off of that. So I'm half a success, but a lot of people might do it and not have any success, or might completely fail. And that's the struggle, right? But you think
Yes.
there's value in so what do you do? Like, first of all, I guess, is it okay to fail? I think we're not very good at failing in this country. We don't talk too much about failure unless somebody comes up on top, fails and then becomes a huge success. Then that's a story. But sometimes people just fail. Like, they don't make
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
Right? We
Totally.
don't talk
Totally.
about that. Yeah.
I have an entire chapter
Yes, you
on
do.
failure, What do you
Right.
do when you flame out? And there's some really interesting research on this. So first of all, two really important pieces of research about failure. There's a wonderful researcher named Dashun Wang at Northwestern who's a data scientist who studies failure. And he said, part of the problem with failure is when you stop trying too soon. And he uses the example of the ice cube, melting an ice cube. So if you put an ice cube in, you have to melt it, and it's in a room that's 21 degrees, and you degree by degree, you keep raising the thing and it's still not melting. And at 31 degrees, you throw up your hands and say, I'll never melt this ice cube,
Right.
right? Whereas if you went one more degree, all of your work, boom, would have succeeded, right? So he said sometimes the problem is quitting too soon. But the other thing that he found is that the people who turn failure into success do it by increments. So instead of throwing up their hands and throwing it out, they actually iterate and iterate and iterate.
Hmm.
And they are the people who are the most successful in saying, like, these are the elements of what I'm working on that are working, and how can I build on those things, versus saying, this isn't working, I'm going to try an entirely new direction. So there's the incremental piece. He's a big incrementalist, talking about incrementalism.
Yeah.
But in terms of understanding if you should even continue or should you
Hmm.
just give it up, I thought one of the most interesting approaches was a woman named Melanie Stefan, who's a unbelievably, I can't even explain to you what she does in her science. She's a scientist in a very complex audio visual field, brain neurological. And I wish I could explain it to you. But anyway,
Right.
she's super impressive. But she told me, she walked me through her story about all of the fellowship she got and this and that and the other thing. And she said, yeah, I sound like a big success, don't I? And she said, and then let me tell you what really happened. And then she walked me through all of her failures on the way to success. And
Mm.
what she did was she realized she's not alone like that. So she created for herself what she calls a CV of failure, where she simply cataloged every failure she's ever had.
Mm.
And when she did it, she then published it, I believe, in
Wow.
Nature magazine. And she said it was so freeing for its, first of all, everybody, the response was viral, overwhelming, because people felt so relieved that everybody fails. Like, you always feel like you're the only person failing. But she said it was also revelatory for her personally, because she realized when she looked at that CV that the areas she was failing in were really more like the kind of biological research that you need to do by hand, watching fish and this and that and the other thing, right? Whereas what she was really good at was computational biology.
Mm.
And it made her realize that she had been focusing on the wrong part of her
Interesting.
field, and she needed to pivot to the areas where she had proven successes. And she only realized that after cataloging her failures.
That's
And
so
so it helped
interesting.
her
Do you think that
pivot.
would be a good exercise for people in general, like if they're failing?
Yes.
Just like
Yeah,
where do you keep failing? And then think, and it's kind of like, the definition of insanity. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. Like people, I think they keep failing and they keep making the same mistake. And maybe it's just a slight pivot. Like maybe that's just not your thing, but you have another thing, right?
exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And it can lead you, toward the direction in which you actually have both interest and talent.
Yeah. So interesting. All right. Let's talk about stop. What explain so in the search, so to refresh and to go back, you have the 4 steps are search, struggle, stop. And the stop is interesting because you mentioned it, you sort of in the context of when you're actually coming up with ideas for your next move. But let's say you're in the midst of your transition. Do you also stop? Like, is there a time to reflect and stop? And is that kind of what you mean as well?
Absolutely, 100%. So, a great example of that would be a woman named Marla Ginsburg, who I met. She's very cool, Marla Ginsburg. So she started out as a very high-powered television executive, actually, and she was in Paris, and she had this great job. She was one of those most powerful women kind of people. She gets a big job in LA. She moves to LA. She buys the big house. She has the nanny for the kids. She's got the swimming pool. She's got the works, right? But her timing was terrible. She gets there. There's a writer's strike. There's the financial
Mhm.
crisis. She loses her job. She can't pay her bills. She's a single mom, can't pay her bills. She drains the pool. She fires the nanny. She rents out a room in her house. Like, it's just all going south for her. And she's over 50. As she said, she's over 50, a woman in Hollywood. She figures she's never going to get another job in Hollywood. And, she said her only dreams, which were kind of crazy, stupid dreams, were like she'd always wanted to be a talk show host or a clothing designer. And she had no experience in either. She didn't know how to sew. She knew
Right.
nothing. But with her dwindling funds, she goes to Sears, she buys a sewing machine, and she starts and she Googles, like, how do you thread a bobbin? And she starts like making things in her garage. Her kids think she is absolutely insane. But she starts like showing them to her friends, and she actually gets a little bit of traction. And she actually does pivot into clothing design, but not all that successfully. Like she gets a spot on Home Shopping Network through her agent, but then the person who manufactured the clothes disappeared on her, so she doesn't have anybody to manufacture clothes, and then she loses her house. She moves to Canada to try again. Like she's struggling. And then, but she is sort of in that struggle period, right? She is starting to make her way as a designer. And then she gets the stop, which is her son was diagnosed with, I believe it's Parkinson's. Her son is seriously ill, young son. And he goes for treatment. She doesn't have the right insurance. He goes for treatment in Amsterdam, where his father lives. And she gets a borrowed apartment to follow so she can be with her son. And she said it was the most amazing thing because she had to stop everything. And she was in Amsterdam by herself, only focused on her son and his treatments and getting him schooling there. And, but all by herself, not knowing anyone. And she said it was the weirdest thing because the change in scene plus the absolute stopping in her tracks, she said suddenly she had this like creative spurt. And she came up with this idea for her brand is called Marla Wynn. You can get it on Home Shopping Network. She came up with this idea for Marla Wynn layers, which is, you know, all these pieces that all work together and you can layer them in any which way. And anyway, it was this big creative burst and it really turned her business around. And she is now, her son, luckily, again, he survived, he thrived, he's good, thank God. But she's now back in the States. She is a major superstar if you watch Home Shopping Network. And by the way, she is the face of her brand as well. So as she said, she got a twofer. She is both a talk show host and
Right.
a clothing designer. But yeah, I mean, it was in the middle of that transition where she had to stop. So yeah,
Right.
definitely.
So that was a stop that she couldn't control. That was a horrible, unfortunate accident. Are there stops that are sort of more man-made that you should sort of impose to, like, you talk about this whole thing like distraction, relaxation, positivity. Is that part of the stopping? Like the taking time to sort of reflect?
Yes.
Right.
So what you're talking about is particularly in creativity research.
Yeah.
If you want to get an aha moment,
Yep.
the way that you do it. And by the way, there's a very wonderful book written. I think James Webb was the guy who wrote it years and years ago. He was an advertising guy, and he wrote a tiny little book called The Creation of Ideas. And he described this exact process. This is well before there was any neuroscience behind it.
Right.
But the neuroscience proves it, that what you need to do is collect all kinds of information and think and brainstorm and whatever. And you will get to a point, he says in this little book, where you can't think anymore and you don't have any good ideas and you must stop. You absolutely must stop and go for a walk or, go for a run or go to sleep or take a shower. And that's when the ideas in the back of your brain can kind of coalesce and come up with this great new thought, this new that emerges as an aha moment, which neuroscientists, when they've actually studied the brain with very sophisticated like fMRI machines, they can actually see the spark happen when you have an aha moment. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I love this because, I mean, like you said before, your aha moment for this book came in the middle of the night, like when you're sleeping. I think most of my good ideas have come, when I'm not sitting in front of my computer, like agonizing over it. I think there's sort of like a default mode that we go into, like when we're trying to come up with ideas, like, like I'll do this things, like I'll start making like spreadsheets, like here are my pros and cons of this idea. And like, and I'm like, and I try to like, I don't know, I try to like work it out analytically. And I don't think it really works that way. Like what I should have done is like going out and taking a walk, right? Like so many people have come on this show and said that walks help them come up with ideas. You mentioned like, I think Steve Jobs was a big walker. There's a lot of Bill Gates is a big walker. There's a lot of big thinkers that are big walkers.
Yes. Yeah. But it's actually the analytical part is important too, right? You do the analytical work first.
Right.
But then you have to put the analytical work away and get away from the analytical piece of it. There's a related, this is one of my favorite hacks ever. I mentioned this in the book. That I take no credit for. It was from Tony Schwartz, who is maybe somebody you had on your podcast. So Tony is a former journalist who is most famous now because he actually was the ghostwriter for Donald Trump's first book,
Oh, right.
The Art of the
Yes, The
Deal.
Art
And
of
then
the Deal.
he became a big Trump critic.
Right.
But anyway, my first book, I was having horrible, horrible writer's block. And I was on my way to Davos to cover the World Economic Forum.
Hmm.
And I was on a plane, an overnight flight in misery after, 4 days of staring at a blank cursor on my computer. I was miserable. And in the middle of the night, I had switched planes and I found myself sitting with Tony. And I was pouring out my misery to him. and he said, you got to try the 90-minute rule. And to this day, I use it. So I will share the
Oh, I love
90-minute
this.
rule. It's the best. The 90-minute rule is that when you're working on something that requires focus and concentration and creativity, like writing a book, you sit for 90 minutes with zero distractions. Turn off the phone. Don't look at your email or Facebook or anything else. You must focus for 90 minutes. But at the end of 90 minutes, you have to stop and take a break. It is required that you stop and take a break. Doesn't matter what you do. You could eat, swim, sleep, walk, whatever, as long as you're not doing what you were doing. And then you go back to it. And Tony said, you're not going to be able to do this more than 3 times a day. But in three 90-minute spurts, you will get more done than you would get working 12 hours straight. And it's so right. Because what it does, it imposes this discipline on you where you're focused and you're like, I have to get to the end of this chapter or the end of this sentence or paragraph by my 90-minute alarm clock, right? And so it forces you to just put something down on paper or to get whatever the work is that you're doing to just get to a stopping point. And then you have to stop. And then it really does refresh your brain. When you take that break, you come back and you're refreshed. And suddenly it's so much more clear. It cured my writer's block.
That sounds, sort of like a variation on the Pomodoro technique, which I think is shorter, but still, like, I love this idea that you give yourself a concentrated, and again, turn off your phone and don't do research during that period either, because I think a lot of trap that maybe you do, but a lot of the trap that I find a lot of writers get into is like they're writing something, they're like, oh, but I have to find out more about that, and then they kind of go down some rabbit hole of research for that 90 minutes and waste the time that they should have just been writing. I have a friend who's a big writer who basically will write, in parentheses, need to research this and keep going. Like he won't stop to do the research because that'll take you down a rabbit hole and distract you.
That's actually a great tip too. I love that one.
Right. He's a good one. I love this. Oh, wow. The 90-minute rule. I'm going to try that like today because I need my 90 minutes. Let's see here. So, I mean, I feel like we've really covered everything. The solution we've come to many solutions. One of my favorite stories, and I think one that might be inspiring to people to sort of end with is, and you talk about him a lot in the book, is James Patterson's story. First of all, you met him, so it's a real personal story for you. But tell us the story of James Patterson, because I think a lot of my listeners are kind of aspiring to have the life that he now leads, right?
I think every writer aspires to have his life.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's such a great story. It's an amazing story. So when I was a very young reporter in my early 20s, I covered the advertising business for the Wall Street Journal.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, it was all about the burger wars, Burger King versus McDonald's.
Right.
And because I covered advertising, I went one morning to talk to the head of the Burger King account at J. Walter Thompson, James Patterson. And so I walk in and he's an ad guy. It's early in the morning. I am not a morning person.
Right.
So I'm all bleary eyed. And he's like, oh yeah, I've been up for hours already. Because what I really want to be is a novelist.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, sure. Rolling your eyes. Yeah, sure, guy.
Yeah.
Right. And he says, I got a book published, and he hands me this book. I put it in my bag and totally forget about it. Take out my reporter's notebook, ask him about the burger wars. And then I don't know, maybe a week or 2 or 3 later, I'm taking a plane ride. I pull out his book. I read the book. I don't really talk about the book myself but I do quote Kirkus in Next, which Kirkus said about this book. It was abysmal and deserved drowning.
This is struggle.
I am quoting.
The struggle. Yes, this is the struggle phase of James Patterson's career. So Kirkus hated his book.
Kirkus hated his book. And I'm like, well, you know what? Good thing he has a day job. He's got a really good day
Yeah.
job. So never really didn't think twice about it. And I talked to him over time, because he was a source for me as an advertising writer. So, but then I went on to other things, and probably almost 10 years later, it was when I'm like in my kitchen making dinner or something, and I see him on TV popping up in a commercial, and there he is holding up his latest book, and he says, "Hi, this is James Patterson, and I want to tell you about Along Came a Spider."
Oh my goodness.
And I was like, "Holy, that's what happened to my ad guy. Wow." Because I
Yeah.
hadn't kept track at all,
Right.
and I was totally shocked. And so I followed his career with great interest ever since, remembering him from back then. So when I started working on Next, I was thinking about great career transition, great career transformations. So I actually got back in touch with him, and I went through. I asked his publisher if they could put me in touch, and like 5 minutes later, the phone rings, and it's like, "Hey, it's Jim Patterson." And he spent a lot of time on several conversations with me and walked me through like what happened between when I first met him to get where he is today. And he literally went through all those steps. It turns out that he wrote he actually wrote his first book when he was in his 20s, and he
Mhm.
was a young ad guy, and it got great reviews, and he thought he was off and running. And then he wrote a bunch of books that did not get good reviews, and that he as he has explained to me, like he had to find his voice. And so he would write books, and he got some published, but they were sort of not really making any kind of noise. And it was that he didn't really know who he was as a writer. And so he kept to his day job. And he was another one who said his dad always told him, like, you need a job that's going to pay the bills.
Mhm.
He came from relatively very, very modest circumstances in
Right.
Newburgh, New York. And so he really, valued having a job. And he wanted to be a writer, but it wasn't something that seemed like a real job, like a real thing
Yeah.
that he could do. And even as he started writing books that started then becoming successful, he started finding his voice. He said he was afraid to leave. Like, what if
Yeah.
he's not good enough? What if he can't make a living? And ultimately, and by the way, the way he found his voice is really interesting. He told me that he writes still in pencil, in longhand, on lined paper,
Wild.
and he outlines his books in advance. And what he told me was that for the book that became Along Came a Spider, he had done a lot of research on it first, which he didn't used to do.
Right.
So
That
he
was
did a lot of factual research, and then on top of that, when he wrote his outline, he kept on writing more and more and more on the outline. And ultimately, he walked around with the outline trying to figure out how to make it into a book. And at one point, he had that aha moment. And he said, "Oh, wait, the outline is the book."
Mm.
And that is why when you read his books, they're short chapters, they move really fast,
Yeah.
they're pretty spare, the chapters, and it's all about the action and the plot. And that's how he developed his style. But his big aha moment was he was coming home one day on a Sunday night. He had a beach house in New Jersey. He's stuck in traffic on the New Jersey Turnpike, and going back to the office, and he's looking on the other side of the road, and on the other side of the road, and he said to me, it's whoosh whoosh, these other
Yeah.
cars in the other direction going back to the beach. And he said he had the aha moment, like, I'm on the wrong side of the road, I
I
got to
want
get to the other side.
Oh,
And he
interesting.
went back to New York and quit his job.
Mm.
And
Wow.
that was his moment where he said, I'm a writer, I'm leaving the ad world behind. By the way, he was almost 50 years old at that point. I think he was
Yeah.
49 at that point. I mean, it was a long time coming.
Yeah. It's also a good example of like, you don't have to quit your day job right away. I mean, he was able to do both for a long time until he just came
Yeah,
out of his time. So no more excuses. Well, I can't have enough time to write. Yes, you do. If James Patterson can do it, you can do it.
exactly.
One last question for you, just because I'm so interested. There's so much good research in this book. And you're obviously, a seasoned reporter, award-winning reporter, has worked in many, many high-level jobs. But how did you research this book? I mean, it seems like it would take forever to kind of research a book like this. I mean, did you just get on the internet and just search, or tell me your process?
Yeah. So, well, I started with I started, with the circle of people who I knew and then expanded. And
Right.
I was looking for great examples of people. James Patterson, I knew.
Yeah.
Will Brown, the farmer, was actually Harvard roommates with somebody I knew.
Okay.
I put something out in my alumni magazine if anybody had great stories. I put some things on Facebook. That was in order to collect stories. And I did a lot of Googling of just, people with second careers or new careers. And then I did a ton of reading of academic research papers, just
Mm.
probably hundreds of academic research papers on the process of change. And
How did
then I
you find
saw,
those? The academic research paper, Google's
I started out with
scholar.
Google, like tell me studies about aha moments. And then I
That would be
looked at,
Chat GPT, but anyway.
and then I looked at who were the primary experts in each of those areas. And so,
Yeah.
I have a chapter on post-traumatic growth. How do you come back from trauma? And there's a guy named Richard Tedeschi, who is the originator of the phrase. And I found him. He's an amazing person who spent a ton of time with me. And when I found interesting studies, I would always call the researcher, and then they would recommend other researchers.
So but you got on the phone. I think maybe people of a certain generation might not use the phone as much as we do, but you still think it's important to talk to people and interview.
Not only on the phone, but I was desperate to talk to people in person because I had to do so much of it on the phone because we were all in lockdown.
Yeah.
The first interview I did in person, we were very fortunate. We have a house in upstate New York. And when I learned about the farmer, I can't even tell you how excited I was. It was the first interview I was able to do in person because I could go outside and be social distanced and watch him work. And he was, local. Yeah, it was frustrating. I love to do my interviews in person. I think they're better when you're in person and you have the scenes, you can set the scenes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was
in journalism, you comes out with that. I agree with that. It's so much better when you're there. I hate these days having to like email people questions and stuff like that. All right. This has been amazing, Joanne. First of all, do you have a podcast?
I do not have a podcast.
Okay, here's my pitch.
I like being on yours.
Yeah, but you should have your own. And you also have a mic and everything. It's such a great topic. All right, that's my pitch to you. But anyway, this has been fantastic. If people want to know more about you, the book is called Next, The Power of Reinvention in Life and Work. Website, right? JoanneLipman.com.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Soon to have a podcast. No, I'm just kidding. And you speak, right? You speak like about this topic and other topics, like
I do.
You and that.
Yes. Yeah. People can book me. If you go on my website, you'll find the information for booking me. I do a lot of speaking. I love doing speaking and workshops and working with organizations. I learned so much from them as well.
Yeah.
And at JoanneLipman.com, you can find all my information. You can contact me. You can contact you can learn more about the book. And you can buy the book. It's out March 21. So if this is before March 21, you can pre-order. I would love for you to pre-order, and because that's really important for publishers. But it's available everywhere. Amazon, your local bookstore. We love independent local bookstores, and wherever you buy your books.
It is such a great book. I really recommend it. I'm excited to kind of go back and reread it because I had to read it quickly for this interview, and now I want to really dive in. But it's just chock full of information and great stories and inspirational stories and good research. Joanne, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation, and you'll be a great example for the sequel.
Okay, when the sequel comes out, I would love a page. It would be helpful. But I'd be delighted to talk to you. And you're going to be an example in my book whenever I write it, whatever that's going to be. But I know I need to write one. All right,
you got a deal.
All right, thank you.